Thank you very much, panelists, for sharing these perspectives on offshore wind. We're going to transition real fast from offshore wind to hydrogen. Our next panel will examine the clean energy economy and the promise of hydrogen and emissions, the future promise of innovation. Please join me in welcoming our next set of panelists and our moderator, Lesley Hunter, the Senior Vice President of Policy and Engagement from the American Council on Renewable Energy.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. Pleased to be moderating this last panel here, The Promise of Hydrogen. So I'm here representing ACORE. We are a national nonprofit organization that is focused on advancing the clean energy transition, and we work with developers, manufacturers, investors, off-takers, and many others throughout the landscape to help expand clean energy access to all Americans. I lead ACORE's policy work, including our work on government affairs and our research and analysis. But we have a really great group joining us today. I'm pleased to be introducing them. First, we have Paul Wilkins, Vice President for Policy and Government Engagement at Electric Hydrogen. We have Beau Berthelot, Vice President of Business Development and Government Affairs at Maritime Partners. Michael Hoban, General Manager of Hydrogen at Chevron New Energies. And Rachel Fox, Senior Policy Advisor at API. And please join me in welcoming them to the stage. Thanks so much. So each of you brings a unique perspective to this panel, being positioned differently across the hydrogen landscape. So let's just start with just a brief discussion about how you're all looking at this sector. But starting with Paul, can you discuss electric hydrogen's new electrolyzer technology and how this product can really help with issues like scalability and costs?
Sure. Thanks so much, Lesley, for having us here, and thanks to the entire CREZ team for this great conference. Electric Hydrogen is a manufacturer of PEM electrolyzers, and our mission is to make the world's most powerful electrolyzers for the lowest cost hydrogen. And to give you a sense of sort of how we're designing our product and how we're approaching the market, I'll go back to our founding story of the company. So two of our founders were the first two CTOs of a company called First Solar, obviously one of the legacy solar panel manufacturers in the US. And really what their idea is there's about 25% of global GHG emissions that you really need a clean molecule to address. And hydrogen is one of the best options for addressing those industries. So their focus was, how do we make a clean molecule that can actually compete on an unsubsidized basis to help decarbonize those industries? How do we make green hydrogen a thing? And the answer to that is you got to make it a lot cheaper than it is today. And so they really looked at what are the conditions that you'd need to meet in order to have green hydrogen be cost competitive. And the two conditions really are, you've got to have the total installed CapEx of that electrolyzer at around $300 a kilowatt on a fully installed basis. And you've got to power that electrolyzer with electricity that costs less than $20 a megawatt hour. Unless you can meet both of those two conditions, you can't make it cost competitive. And so what that told us was incumbent technology providers, Western technology providers are selling systems for around $2,000 a kilowatt. And so we've got to reduce the CapEx of the electrolyzer by about 85%. But if you look at what solar did over the course of the last decade, they achieved about an 82% cost reduction. So we got to replicate that rate of learning. And then second, the only electricity that costs less than $20 a megawatt hour is unfirm electricity, whether that's intermittent renewables, hydro that otherwise would just be spilled, or nuclear that's out of the money and has to be, and is selling at a loss. So we designed a large-scale PEM electrolyzer because they are the electrolyzers that you can make the most power dense, that's highly rampable to be able to capture those low cost. The other things that we're doing different is we're making really big systems. So electrolyzers are a nascent industry. We make 100 megawatt systems. That's the scale you have to be at to decarbonize heavy industry, things like petrochemical refining, ammonia fertilizer production. And then lastly, we're making modular systems to squeeze out EPC cost. And we think the combination of that power density, scale, and modularity are the sort of the roadmap for squeezing out cost.
Great, thanks so much, Paul. And Beau, can you share more information about Maritime Partners' work with hydrogen for use in maritime transportation?
Yes, happy to do that, Lesley. So Maritime Partners we're a vessel leasing platform. We own but do not operate about 1,850 Jones Act vessels. They comprise MR tankers down to inland push boats, ship assist tugs, open and covered hopper barges, inland tank barges. Company's been around for about 10 years. About 3 years ago, just before I started, so 4 years ago, the founders got together and said, hey, we want to be good stewards of our industry. Everything that we runs an internal combustion diesel engine. What's next for the industry in terms of the energy transition? They went out, they surveyed all the materials, all of the different technologies, fuel supply, analyzed the system, and they arrived on a very novel concept, which I was watching from the outside looking in, where you extract hydrogen from methanol. So Maritime Partners is building a vessel right now that will load methanol, convert the methanol into hydrogen, and then fuel the vessel with hydrogen fuel cells. So that's why I'm on the panel, as otherwise just a maritime guy. So.
Thanks so much. And Michael, can you speak to the placement of hydrogen in Chevron's portfolio and which technologies you're prioritizing?
Sure, thanks, Lesley, and good to be with you all today. So about 3 years ago, Chevron took the step of creating a dedicated and focused business line just on kind of new energy solutions. This was called Chevron New Energies. And in that space, we're focused on how we can leverage our assets and capabilities and relationships to really drive forward the energy transition. Our focus is lowering the carbon intensity of our own operations, as well as creating the low carbon businesses that others are going to need around us. When we look at kind of where we think Chevron can add value, we certainly don't think we can do everything. We think we have specific capabilities in areas, and hydrogen is one of those areas. We're not new to hydrogen. Chevron produces over 1 million tons of hydrogen per year in our traditional business, so this is refining, desulfurization, and hydrocracking. What we're talking about is building new value chains, new low-carbon value chains with hydrogen, and supporting new segments. Our focus is split geographically into the U.S. West Coast, the U.S. Gulf Coast, as well as Asia Pacific. And we're focused on the technologies that we really think hydrogen has a strong use case to play. This is heavy-duty transportation, this is certain power segments, and this is other hard-to-abate industrials like steel making. We have a strong belief that we need to be technology agnostic here, and we're going to go after the pathways that I think most competitive and will serve our customers' needs the best, both in terms of cost and carbon intensity. Again, our belief here is that it has to be affordable, it has to be reliable as we drive down that carbon intensity of these solutions. And we think we're making good progress in the time that we've started this business as well. We have initial applications in each of those kind of geographic sectors. We're looking at heavy-duty transportation, specifically in California. We have some small production projects there as well. Also call out our entry into the Advanced Clean Energy Storage Project in Delta, Utah, also known as ACES. Here we're taking surplus renewable power, running it through about 220 megawatts of electrolyzers, storing that about 100 tons per day of hydrogen into massive underground salt caverns, where we store that hydrogen as a long-term kind of energy solution, run it back through a gas turbine in a power plant, and then provide that low-carbon energy to the LA basin. This plant in itself is important because it just shows kind of the scale and the commitment that we think is needed to drive projects forward in this space. This project alone has about 3 times the total energy storage capacity as all the other grid-connected energy storage solutions in the U.S. today. So we're serious about making these solutions for lower carbon technology a reality, and we think we've got an important role to play.
Well, great. That's really fascinating. And Rachel, for your members, how are they utilizing hydrogen, and too interested in your perspective about what makes hydrogen such an effective tool for reducing emissions in sectors that are hard to decarbonize.
Yeah, absolutely. So just for some background, the American Petroleum Institute has been around for over 100 years, and most people identify the American Petroleum Institute with an advocacy organization, but there's also a tremendous standards side. For any engineers in the room, they're probably familiar with API standards. As you would imagine, having nearly 600 members, there's a whole lot of interest in all aspects of the hydrogen value chain. Producers, midstream suppliers of transportation, pipeline infrastructure, and then end use as well, our refineries, as my Chevron colleague just mentioned. We've been using hydrogen for a long, long time, so this isn't really a new space. We consider hydrogen and carbon capture, for that matter, to be sort of core competencies of the industry already. So it's really, how do we, as API, help develop policies that can commercialize this so we get deployment on the grid? How can we help the sectors that want to be adopting hydrogen maybe develop incentives to maybe shape that up? And then similarly, are there existing standards we can point to for this industry to scale? Where are the gaps, and how can API address that to make sure that as we roll out a future hydrogen economy, that we're doing it responsibly and we have sort of a nice level setting of best practices to point to? But in terms of technologies and the interest there, it's really wide spectrum. It's, as my colleague mentioned, technology agnostic is the key word here, because whether it's methane pyrolysis, electrolysis, SMR, autothermal reforming, we know we need to see all of these solutions deployed if we're going to reach our climate goals. And especially as we consider deep decarbonization, we're not going to be able to achieve that without hydrogen. So a lot of support among our members for the hydrogen economy.
Well, thanks so much. So shifting to policy. So the U.S. has two major policies that are designed to incentivize hydrogen supply. And so those are the 45V tax credit that many of you are aware of, and the Department of Energy's Hydrogen Hubs program. So we are waiting for final Treasury guidance on the 45V tax credit. As many of you are aware, there were proposed guidelines for a three pillars approach within that, but we are expecting final guidance hopefully before the end of this year. So question for the panel, really, how has the delay in Treasury guidance affected the market? And if you'd like to share any specific challenges for projects that you've been engaged in. So I'll open that up to anybody, but if Paul, you would like to start.
Sure, I can
Great.
jump in. The short answer is the delay has frozen the market here in the U.S. Project developers can't get to a final investment decision if they don't know what their revenue streams look like, and until we have final guidance, they just won't know that. And so what that means is projects just are churning water and burning through cash, and so they're not moving forward. And to put some numbers around the impacts of that, today in the U.S., there's only about 150 megawatts of operating electrolyzers. So it's tiny, and to bring down the cost for all of these pathways, we really need to start scaling the industry. In the EU, just in July, there were final investment decisions on 730 megawatts worth of green hydrogen projects. And according to analysis from WoodMac, by the end of 2024, China will have 2.5 gigawatts of operating green electrolysis projects. So the rest of the world is moving forward, and we're treading water, essentially, and we need to change that.
Yes. Any other perspectives?
Go for it.
I'll just say that I think most folks would agree that the hydrogen hubs are flying blind right now. They don't have sufficient policy clarity, policy certainty, and I think that's a direct consequence of just this delay that we're seeing. So I would really hope that we see something soon, so that these first mover projects that we know are so important for de-risking writ large the hydrogen economy, that they have the support they need.
Excellent. Yeah, and two, just to further on that point, and welcome perspectives from the rest of the panel, are the hydrogen hubs proceeding as you expected? And, they are running into roadblocks with the lack of Treasury guidance on 45V, but are there other issues that they're running into as they develop as well? So open that up to...
I'll jump in, yeah. The hydrogen hubs are a big deal. Clearly, we view that there does need to be this kind of hub and collective approach if we really want this hydrogen economy to take off. It is going to require that kind of value chain and coordinated effort, and the hubs are in their ambition trying to do that. It is complicated, though. Chevron is part of 2 of the awarded hubs, both the High Velocity Hub in the U.S. Gulf Coast and the Arches Hub in California. Those are very different hubs in terms of their approach and the membership, but just getting the details between all the different participants within the hubs is hard. I think we had hoped that the timeline for all the work and getting things started would be a little bit faster. It's not surprising that it's taken really quite a long time to try to get things moving, but we're still optimistic that things are moving in the right direction.
Okay. Well, so hopefully we will see that guidance out soon for 45V, but, policy certainty is really critical here. But, we've had some time to kind of digest the proposed guidance. So question for if the 3 pillars were adopted as proposed, how might we see that shake out in the market?
Go ahead, Mike.
And mixed perspectives.
Yeah, I'll go. It will make things slower. It will make things cost more initially. So our view on this is generally hydrogen is a really difficult market to initialize for a lot of reasons. One of those is that everything really has to happen at once. You can't just simply make a supply project and hope it goes into a liquid market. You can't simply go buy a hydrogen fuel cell truck and hope you can find hydrogen for it. So that entire value chain needs to be coordinated together, and that's a real challenge. When you throw in the challenge that the we'll say the kind of strict 3 pillars view has on that, that's additional complexity that needs to be coordinated across the value chain that is really going to hinder essentially the progress and as well as the affordability of hydrogen in the near term.
Thanks.
I'd just add, with the 3 pillars, there really needs to be a view towards what helps get the market moving, right? Because again, the challenge is moving down that cost curve and getting clean hydrogen affordable. And then how do you ensure long-term environmental integrity? And so it really is about sort of striking that practical balance between those 2 in terms of getting the industry off its feet. Mike is right, adding, the 3 pillars will add complexity. We think that there is a healthy balance, though, where you have the rules set so you can get some near-term projects built, probably means there should be some level of grandfathering for some period of time. Early on, that's unlikely to have an impact on emissions in the near term. And then as the industry gets more mature and starts to scale, then you can ensure that there's long-term integrity around there. So, I think there's a developing consensus around that. Many of you may have seen I guess it was yesterday, Fatih Birol, the executive director of the IEA, was essentially making that point, that it's important that the rules have environmental integrity, but you also got to have some near-term flexibility to get projects built.
Exactly. Any other points of view? We can transition. Great, but Paul, you mentioned the EU and the finalized regulations last year. Are there any other takeaways that we can apply to the U.S. market, and are there any specific strategies or lessons that could help to accelerate development here, other than having final regulations?
Yeah, the 2 big ones I'd point to that we can learn from the EU are, 1, having demand-side policies matters, and having strategies for getting novel and first-of-a-kind technologies to bankability matters. And the EU's been moving on both of those fronts. So first on the demand side, the EU has their renewable energy directives that require hydrogen users must source 42% of their hydrogen by 2030 for heavy industry needs to be from essentially green hydrogen. Now, the EU is different than the US. That sort of stick approach doesn't necessarily work here, and society doesn't accept it in the same way in the US as in the EU. However, there are approaches, things like a low carbon fuel standard. The fuels panel earlier today was talking about a national LCFS. That's a market-based approach that sends a demand signal. So there's things like that we can learn, but put them in the American context. Similarly, these are first-of-a-kind technologies, and there is a lot of risk for those, and so we need to have the tools in place to help those early projects get to bankability.
Exactly. Well, great. So, as I mentioned, the policies that we have here in the U.S. are mostly focused on building out the supply for hydrogen. But really, we need more demand-side policies as well. There have been some current proposals in this space, but I'll pose this question first to Beau. What other demand-side policies could further propel growth?
Thank you, Lesley. I don't know if y'all can tell from the audience, but these guys have been talking across me about policy on the supply side, and I, quite frankly, don't know what they're talking about. And that's a problem. It's actually a problem because you mentioned it has to happen all at the same time. People constantly contact us about, hey, we would like to build a vessel, and it runs on ammonia, or it runs on hydrogen, or it runs on some sort of solid state that traps hydrogen and then releases it later. We are fuel type agnostic. We settled on a technology because we saw it as the lowest barrier to entry in terms of how to handle the fuel, where to get the fuel, and what the emissions profile looks like. We've seen a lot of legislation come through for what I think is supply side support, and there is like zero downstream demand side support. And we're going to struggle even if there is because of the way our regulations are set up in the marine space. The regulations will not support the use of a low flash point fuel or a gaseous fuel in their current state, and everything is a case-by-case basis. And they mentioned in the last two panels about regulatory certainty is where the smart money goes. We don't have regulatory certainty, so even if you are able to bring the cost of your electrolyzers down to where you want it to be in a hard-to-emission abate space like the marine space, I still can't use it because I don't have the support as an industry to be able to deploy that hydrogen in any form, whether it's as ammonia or as methanol or as compressed or liquefied hydrogen. So that is a real challenge. And in terms of policy, that's why all these people are in the room and they're smarter than me. But that is what we face from the U.S. domestic maritime industry.
Excellent. And Michael, other thoughts on demand-side policy?
I mean, Beau, you nailed it, right? Suppose we have this world where the supply side policy is sufficient to really drive the cost of hydrogen down to whatever point that you feel it needs to be, whether that be diesel parity or lower, right? If we get there and say, hey, I've got a bunch of cheap hydrogen for you, that doesn't necessarily mean that a customer is ready to adopt it, nor has the means to do so. The technology, whether it's a ship or a truck, is oftentimes going to be more expensive. And what matters to that end user is that total cost of operation, and are they meeting their goals in terms of carbon intensity? So without a demand-side policy to help them get to that point and close that gap, we're only solving a part of the problem.
Excellent, thank you. So shifting to permitting, so permitting reform is urgently needed across the energy sector, and there are proposals for that right now. But looking specifically at the hydrogen sector, Rachel, I'll start with you. What are some of the key challenges for permitting hydrogen projects, and what specific reforms would be needed?
Yeah, I think when we're looking at the hydrogen value chain, it's not all that different from a lot of energy infrastructure or infrastructure in general. I mean, if you're imagining a hydrogen production facility, maybe you'd need some natural gas pipelines, you might need some carbon pipelines, you need some hydrogen pipelines no matter what type of hydrogen you're building if you're providing it in high volumes to an end user. Transmission infrastructure as well, interconnection. These are common themes among a lot of infrastructure, and that's a big challenge in this country right now. So whenever we see legislation that helps kind of meaningfully address the permitting bottlenecks, that's where API and our members are just very hopeful, and we encourage those types of legislation to move forward. I think right now there's some promising proposals on the table that can kind of help figure out some of the constraints around the fact that a lot of projects just get litigated into oblivion. So if there's any way we can move the needle on that in a meaningful way, I think that's desperately needed, because hydrogen is going to have to, especially for the hubs, get to the end user, and that's going to be a major challenge. Above ground trucking, above ground storage, those might be solutions in the near term, but in the long term vision for a hydrogen industry, we're going to need some other solutions, and I think we're not alone in this. I mean, the demand picture for energy resources across the board is only going up in this country. So I'm very intrigued to see what a potential next administration does on this, or maybe even sooner than that.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Rachel. And Paul, do you have other thoughts on permitting reform?
Yeah, I'd just add, in the hydrogen space, it's definitely needed. So we're encouraged by the Manchin-Barrasso bill and some of the transmission pieces in there, because when you're talking about a large-scale hydrogen project, kind of the holy trinity of project development is, do you have access to power, do you have access to financing, and do you have offtake? And access to power is a real challenge when you're talking about trying to do green hydrogen at an ammonia production facility, and you have 300 or 400 megawatts worth of electrolyzers. And so getting that transmission capacity build is really important, and there's some great provisions in that bill for it. But longer term, we really do need to be able to build dedicated hydrogen pipelines to move those molecules, because that's going to be the cheapest way to move those molecules. And there will be some co-location of production and consumption in hydrogen, but there's also going to be, if you look at where are the places where it's cheapest to make green hydrogen because you've got really cheap electricity, you're going to have to move it to market, and it's not always going to be possible to do co-location. So we do have to be able to build pipelines.
That's great, thank you. And when we were planning for this panel, too, we had discussion about just policies needed, extra policy support needed for hard to decarbonize sectors. So are there other policy options that are currently on the table for those sectors, and how do we correctly balance the level of carrots versus sticks? And Paul, if you want to continue on that point.
Sure. I think you're hearing near unanimity on the panel that you really do have to have some demand-side policies, and that's everything from clarity around regulation in certain industries to financial incentives to policies that are driving behavior. So I'd point again to a low-carbon fuel standard as something that a number of states have been doing that. It does create a demand-side signal, but it does it in a technology-agnostic way. And so we do need policies like that that have been proven to work and can drive demand for cleaner fuels, including hydrogen.
Thank you. And Michael, any other thoughts?
In lieu of a price on carbon, I think these are the kind of discussions that we need to be having. I think a nationwide LCFS is along the right path. One of the themes, though, from the discussion today, though, is just simply having some certainty on the policy in terms of what it means, also durability on that policy, so that when companies, developers, users are making decisions, they know that those things are durable and will protect the economics and the financial decisions they're making for the long term here. We talked briefly about permitting reform. I just want to underscore that importance here. We can talk about how great these projects are, but if we can't actually build them or put them in the ground and work with the communities around us who are going to be helping us develop them and benefiting from them, we're not going to be doing this anytime soon.
And on that note, as an actual, smart money, we are a fund. Like the certainty around one project is great, but I need certainty across all the projects. I can't just build one vessel. I can't just build one facility because I've gotten special permitting or unique or one-off permitting. We've got to be able to see we can make an investment here, which turns into investment here, which then turns into investment in auxiliary or ancillary types of facilities that may or may not be required. And until you have all that, it's going to be really hard to get go.
Excellent. Well, thank you. So we're talking about bigger picture policies here. There are also some policy changes that are going under the radar, which are also possible, and there have been jokes at this event about the safety of hydrogen and just the legacy of the Hindenburg, of course. But looking into hydrogen safety, Rachel, question for you. What other standards and policies, such as leak detection, that enhance hydrogen safety are feasible in the near term?
Yeah, I think, we have 1,600 miles of pure hydrogen pipelines today that have, for the most part, been very safe. This is, as I've mentioned before, not really new. Our industry has been managing and controlling what is considered the smallest and toughest molecule on Earth to really control. So safety, when we're thinking about it, is not so much do we have the technology to do it, is are the practices in place so that as things roll out over time, that nothing falls between the cracks. And so you're thinking about chain of custody of moving hydrogen across the entire value chain, maybe even internationally one day on ammonia carrying ships. And so there's a lot that still needs to be done there. We know how to produce hydrogen, we know how to move hydrogen, but a lot of the end use sectors, there might be some territory there to make sure we have standards in place. Leak detection is one of those areas we think our industry is really well positioned to lead on, given a lot of our investments and work on methane detection and monitoring. Hydrogen being a smaller molecule, we really want to make sure we're leveraging our best technologies there, and so our midstream folks are really kind of leading on that. We see a lot of opportunities as well for developing standards around how you characterize the nature of life cycle assessments for hydrogen. I mean, there's still a lot to be done on the full hydrogen value chain, whether it's refueling and what the carbon intensity of all of these different applications could look like. Policy is obviously leading the way there, but there's potentially, need for harmonization internationally. And I think standards, whether they're API or ISO, could really be helpful in that lane.
Yeah, that's helpful. And Beau, how are you approaching hydrogen safety?
So it's interesting you mentioned ammonia carriers because for energy density purposes for a ship, we are volumetrically constrained, we're weight constrained. If you take your hydrogen and then you use another medium in which to transport it, the chemical properties change. So if I make green methanol or I make green ammonia with it, well, now I'm having to provide safety around ammonia and methanol and not pure hydrogen, whether it's compressed or a cryogenic liquid. The other thing that we consider is what is the cost? We can make the vessel as safe as it needs to be, but what is the cost and will the market support that cost? And then you start to say, do I want to carry pure hydrogen? Do I want to carry ammonia? Do I want to carry methanol as a fuel? And that is, look, the end user is the one that has to adopt it. And they're going to go to the path of least resistance. And it's not just going to be cost, but it's going to be operations as well. So if they know that it's going to be safe and they know that their design is going to get permitted by the regulatory body, in our case, the U.S. Coast Guard, then they may lead toward that path because there's certainty that you're going to get your design passed and you're going to be able to build your vessel in a timely manner.
Yeah, thanks so much. So also, looking at hydrogen project development, question for you, Rachel. How are companies working on stakeholder engagement programs, and how are they looking to enhance the environmental justice benefits of hydrogen production? I'm so interested in any observations you have in that space.
Yeah, I think that's a huge question and a really important one. That's something that our members have been incredibly engaged on, especially in the last decade, but really the past few years. Hydrogen Hubs obviously has a major community benefits component, and we see that as a really good example from a policy lens of what that could look like. But one thing we know for sure is that no one approach is going to fit every community. And I think our members have been approaching that through the lens of where can we meaningfully make investments that are going to actually impact the livelihoods of folks and their prospects. And the two lanes that we've really seen a lot of industry activity on are workforce, jobs development, making sure there are resources for folks who want to be part of the energy transition, want to work in hydrogen or carbon capture, that they have the links they need to be able to make those transitions. And then we also have at API our kind of flagship recommended practice called 1185, which maybe some folks have heard about, maybe they haven't, but that sort of set the standard for our best practice on engaging at the community level. And we think that there's a lot of work to be done still, but at least we have sort of our orienting guidelines to make sure that we're not approaching a situation without knowledge of who we are as industry going into communities where they have traditionally probably had not a lot of say on what exists in their backyard. So we're very conscious, and I know our members are making a lot of investments to make sure they're addressing this.
Thank you, Rachel. Any other thoughts on community engagement?
I'll just add that whether it's hydrogen or any other project, similar to the discussion on permitting, it's important that we're bringing communities along with us for this journey and what we're trying to do. The challenge ahead of us, whether that's for hydrogen or whatever it is in the energy transition, is really big. So those communities are key stakeholders, and we're proud of how we engage and what we do to engage. I will say that, back to this hydrogen safety conversation that we were just having, there's a certain amount of kind of demystification of hydrogen that also needs to happen. I think maybe folks in this room have an understanding of what hydrogen can be used for and why it's important, but I don't think that's necessarily shared within the general public. So we've got our work cut out for us in terms of how we engage and how we educate what needs to be done here with hydrogen.
Certainly. That's great. So manufacturing. So there's been a real renaissance in clean energy manufacturing post-IRA and other federal policies that have come out recently. And that's inclusive of hydrogen electrolyzers. So question for Paul, how can the U.S. continue this momentum and then also compete with China, who is also ramping up their capacity?
Yeah, great question. So the exciting thing about where we are in the industry right now is the electrolyzer industry is really where solar was 25 years ago. It is a really nascent industry. As I mentioned before, there's only 150 megawatts of operating electrolyzers in the U.S. We're just at the beginning of the journey. And because of that, electrolyzer manufacturing is still pretty dispersed across the globe with a very strong manufacturing base here in the U.S. as well. But if we want to retain that, the first thing we need to do is start building up the scale and start building up demand domestically. I mentioned the numbers before that WoodMac's projecting for operating capacity of electrolyzers in China by the end of the year. And they're starting to get scale and starting to move down the cost curve. And if they move down faster than we are, there's a real risk that the industry starts to move manufacturing overseas. And for energy security reasons, for all of the supply chain concerns that COVID laid bare, we need to make sure that we are retaining that manufacturing base and retaining the technological leadership that we have here in the U.S. So that goes to policies like 45X. It goes to how are we making sure that we're having appropriate domestic content policies for some of the incentives and demand side programs that we do have for hydrogen.
Thanks so much. Any other thoughts on the U.S. competitiveness in the hydrogen sector? Manufacturing or production?
I will note that, so not us, not our customers, but our customers' customers are inquiring, how is the steel manufactured in the vessel? New construction, they want to know, where did the steel come from? How was it manufactured? What component of the process used something other than traditional fossil-based energy? So it's not directly to us, but the conversation is there, and it's growing.
The other thing I'll just shout out on the subject, and I was remiss not to mention at the top, was Congressman Stewart was here earlier. He's got his Prove It Act. Policies like that show that U.S. manufacturers are making their product with lower embedded carbon emissions are going to be really important from a competitiveness perspective, because we have to make sure that the world is living up to the same standards that we hold ourselves to.
Exactly. That's great. So we can now turn to questions from the audience, if there are any, or online. There's one back there.
Thank you very much. Great presentations, and I would love to see more visuals on this, because I'm sure there's a lot to show on your projects, and that includes, of course, the entire conference. But I wanted to ask you, is there, in the next couple of years, whatever administration comes in the next 3 to 5 years, how much progress do you think we'll make, and will America continue to have an advantage? Will it benefit the United States somehow and our economy, what you're doing, and will we will benefit from a competitive advantage as far as energy across the world?
I'll take a first swing at that. Thanks for the question. When the IRA first came out and the 45V kind of production tax credit was announced, and we were looking at what those implications were for hydrogen production in the U.S., it was clear that production here domestically could be the most competitive production for hydrogen anywhere in the world. And that still can be true. If we do this right and we get the clarity that we need and we can get to FID decisions with policy certainty, we see the demand side develop and the market really develop here, the U.S. has all the ingredients to be highly competitive, if not the most competitive hydrogen producer in the world. Now that's a lot of details that need to come together to make that happen, but all the fundamentals are there if we can actually tie all these pieces and make the connections. Policy is a really big piece of that.
I might also add on a little bit to that, because I think the IRA is a really fascinating policy through the lens of, first and foremost, it's about emissions reductions, if not inflation reduction, but also it's about maintaining the U.S. as a competitive force for the green energy transition. And I think no matter what side of the political spectrum you land on, the common theme we see there is a real awareness that bringing domestic manufacturing back to the U.S. is just a good thing for both potential admins that we could be facing next year. So we see, in some sense, the IRA being, under some scenarios, a really kind of rehoming, refocusing on what our competitive advantage really is. And I think that plays pretty well across all bases politically. If that is the message that we need to look at going forward, I think there's a great case for it. So it kind of checks a lot of boxes, and we're hopeful that it will be able to carry on as we look at developing competitiveness globally.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Any other questions? Back there?
Hi there, Katie Cullen with SC Partners. Thank you all very much. It's been a really good day, and this is a great sort of panel to end the panels for this 2 days. But looking at the regulatory certainty that everyone needs, is there a thought on how to coordinate? Because our hydrogen should be exported. There should be hydrogen that is imported, and it should be a global product. How do you see these regulatory processes that are going on globally to actually, who's going to coordinate that process to make sure that our hydrogen will be allowed in the EU and that the EU hydrogen will be allowed here, et cetera, et cetera? Just kind of wondering who is going to do that piece of it.
It's a great question, Katie.
I'll jump in because it's a great question. Hydrogen has a potential to play an important geopolitical role for the U.S. as well, because there are allies of ours that are going to be net energy importers. So countries like Japan, South Korea, the EU are going to be net energy importers, and hydrogen delivered potentially as ammonia or other hydrogen carriers can be a way that we can strengthen ties with our allies and make sure that they're staying strong, while at the same time developing our resources here and developing economic opportunity here. But there does need to be that harmonization of standards so that we have the same carbon intensity-based standards and clear rules of the road for being able to export those molecules to the EU or to Japan or to South Korea or other jurisdictions. And the EU there's a couple issues right now that are really, there's a lack of clarity around that need to be clarified to ensure that US developers that are doing hydrogen for export can actually get their molecules and that they'll meet the requirements in the EU. So it's a really important question.
Yeah, definitely. Any other viewpoints?
It's a really important question, and I think one that we need to figure out. I think just talking about the life cycle standards that were just mentioned earlier as well, I think are going to be really important. Making sure that we're clear and consistent in that approach is going to be, I think, a starting point. We've got a lot of work to do on that.
Yes. So time will tell, but it is very important. Other questions? We have one back here.
Thank you, everyone. Very enlightening. Michael, I think you touched on how with hydrogen, the supply chain is really tricky to figure out. What aspect in particular do you think poses the hardest challenge?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think not necessarily the most difficult challenge, but maybe perhaps one that is currently underappreciated is the midstream aspect of hydrogen within this value chain. I think we have technology and companies who are really focused on the supply piece. I'm confident we'll get there. We've got OEMs and other folks on the far demand side who are looking at how we deploy fuel cells and get that piece. I think there's not a lot of attention today on that midstream component. How are we going to effectively move those hydrogen molecules from the supply sources to where those demand locations are? That could be, in some instances, up to about 2/3 of the total cost of the hydrogen to that end user. And that's one area that I think we're not having enough discussions about just yet. So that's probably what I'd say. Open to other thoughts, though.
I'll second what Michael said and add in there storage as part of the midstream infrastructure. Because as I mentioned before, you know, the lowest cost green hydrogen is going to come from variable sources of electricity. That means if you're on the demand side and you have a firm offtake requirement, you're going to have storage. The cheapest storage is salt cavern storage. There's some projects in the works that Michael's company is a part of. But we're going to need permitting around storage, and we're going to need some focus around how do you incentivize the development of those types of projects.
Well, we are just at our time here. This was a great discussion. We covered a lot of territory. Thank you so much to our panelists for joining.
Thank you very much for that enlightening discussion. It is now my privilege to introduce the final featured speaker for our programming today.